Welcome to American Government and Politics. Before we can talk about any of the institutions you probably already have opinions about, Congress, the presidency, the courts, the parties, we need to slow down and agree on what a few basic words actually mean. Politics, government, power, authority, the state. These words get tossed around constantly in everyday conversation, and they almost never mean quite the same thing twice. So, this first section is about giving you a shared vocabulary, a toolkit. Once you have it, everything else in this course will hang on it. Let's start with the word politics itself. Politics comes from the Greek word politika, which referred to the affairs of the polis, the ancient Greek city-state. So, at its root, politics is about how a community manages its common life. A more formal way of putting it, politics is the process by which individuals and groups develop, defend, and alter the general rules by which they live together. Notice that word, process. Politics isn't a thing you arrive at, it's something you do continuously because people disagree. Now, the moment you start talking about the rules a community lives by, you bump into a really important distinction: the public sphere versus the private sphere. The public sphere is the realm of issues that affect the well being of everyone. The private sphere is the realm of personal matters that don't really concern the wider population. Libertarians and classical liberals draw a sharp, bright line between the two. They argue that family life, business relationships, and what consenting adults do in their homes belong firmly in the private sphere, and politics should stay out of it. But not everyone agrees that line is so clear. Feminist thinkers gave us the famous slogan, "The personal is political." The idea that gender inequality inside the home and inside the family is the root of inequality in public life, so you can't really separate the two. Marxists go further still, arguing that economic relations shape everything, and the so called private sphere is just where exploitation hides. The German philosopher Jürgen Habermas adds another wrinkle. He describes the public sphere as a kind of social space where different viewpoints get aired and citizens reason together about common problems. The point for you to take away is this: where we draw the line between public and private is itself a political question. It's contested. It always has been. Okay, politics involves rules and rules involve disagreement. So politics is fundamentally about two things at once: conflict and cooperation. Conflict because human beings have different wants, different needs, different opinions about what the good life looks like. Cooperation because we have to find some way to live together without resorting to violence every time we disagree. That's the whole point of having rules in the first place. They tell us who wins and who loses without anybody having to pull a knife. Some thinkers take a tougher view. They define politics simply as the distribution of resources, values, and social status, what's sometimes called power politics. In this view, there's no such thing as legitimate politics, only winners and losers. Karl Marx looked at liberal democracy and said, that's not a real political system. That's just capitalists dressing up their class interests as universal principles. Anarchists go even further and reject the legitimacy of all government, full stop. Most political scientists don't go that far. Most political scientists treat the question of legitimacy, what makes power rightful, as one of the central questions of the whole discipline. Which brings us to two words you'll hear me use constantly this semester: power and authority. Power is the ability to influence others. Authority is power that's recognized as legitimate, the acknowledged right to exercise power. A robber with a gun has power over you. A judge in a courtroom has authority. The difference matters. The political scientist David Easton famously defined politics as the authoritative allocation of values, meaning the binding decisions about who gets what in a society. And Hannah Arendt gave us a beautiful complementary idea. Power, she said, is acting in concert. Power isn't just one person dominating another, it's what emerges when people coordinate together. Now, here's where we need to distinguish between political science and political philosophy because they're not the same thing. Political science is a social science. It uses observation, evidence, experiments where possible, and tries to be empirical, to describe what is, without sneaking value judgments into the description. That methodology comes from a tradition called positivism. Political philosophy is different. Political philosophy asks normative questions, not what is, but what ought to be. Science asks, what is it? Philosophy asks, what ought it to be? We'll be doing some of both in this course, but it helps to know which one you're doing at any given moment. Let's turn to the state, and I'll capitalize that S when I'm talking about the state as a concept to distinguish it from, say, the state of California. The most influential definition we have comes from the German sociologist Max Weber. Weber defined the state as the human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Read that again. Other actors in society can use violence, criminals do, parents disciplining children do, but the state is the only actor that can claim its use of force is legitimate. That's the test. That's what makes the state the state. Weber also gave us three different sources of political legitimacy. The first is traditional authority, power based on history, custom, and long-standing practice. Think hereditary monarchy or tribal elders. The second is charismatic authority, power based on the extraordinary personal qualities of a leader. Think Joan of Arc or Martin Luther King Jr., or more troublingly, demagogues throughout history. The third is legal rational authority, power based on a system of impersonal, formal, written rules. And legal rational authority is the dominant form in modern democratic states. When the President of the United States leaves office and the next person takes the oath, what's being honored isn't tradition, and it isn't the magnetism of any particular person. It's a set of legal rules everyone has agreed to play by. Peaceful transfer of power through elections is, historically speaking, one of the most extraordinary achievements humans have ever pulled off. Different kinds of governments arrange that authority in very different ways. On one end of the spectrum, the government decides everything. On the other end, there's anarchy, no government at all. The form a government takes, the set of rules that organize how it operates, is called the political regime. Now, I have to flag something about that word because in everyday English, the word regime sounds negative. It sounds like we're talking about a dictatorship. But in political science, it's a neutral term. It just means the institutional shape of a government. The United States has a regime, a democratic republic. France has a regime. North Korea has a regime. The regime is the form. There are four main types of regimes we'll talk about: democracy, theocracy, autocracy, and totalitarianism. To classify any given regime, political scientists look at three things: how decisions get made, where sovereignty supposedly comes from, and how dominant the official ideology is. Democracy, from the Greek demos meaning the people and kratos meaning power, rests on popular sovereignty, the principle that the state's authority comes from and is sustained by the consent of the people. Democracy itself comes in two main forms: direct democracy, where citizens participate directly in making the rules, like the citizens of ancient Athens voting on policy in the agora, or modern echoes like ballot referendums and citizen initiatives, and representative democracy, usually in the form of a republic, where the people hold ultimate power but exercise it indirectly through elected officials. James Madison made the case for this form in the Federalist Papers, the idea that representatives can refine and channel popular passions rather than being swept along by them. Within representative democracies, we then distinguish between liberal democracies and illiberal democracies. Liberal democracies aren't just countries that hold elections, they're constitutional systems that genuinely protect individual rights with separation of powers and real checks and balances. And, pay attention to this, having a written constitution is not the same as being a constitutional government. Saddam Hussein's Iraq had a constitution. It was not a constitutional government. The document is necessary, but absolutely not sufficient. The Economist Intelligence Unit, which publishes the Democracy Index every year, sorts countries into four buckets: full democracies, flawed democracies, hybrid regimes, and authoritarian regimes. The middle two are where things get interesting, and where in 2026 a surprising number of countries now sit, which brings us to where we actually are in 2026. One of the most documented trends in comparative politics over the last decade is democratic backsliding. The VDEM Institute and Freedom House have both reported that the share of the world's population living under democracy has dropped to levels we haven't seen since the mid 1990s. A new pattern has emerged that scholars call competitive authoritarianism, systems where elections still happen, but the incumbent government has quietly rigged the rules to make sure they win. Hungary under Viktor Orban, Turkey under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and yes, parts of the conversation here at home in the United States, especially after the contested 2020 election and the events of January 6th, 2021. Scholars like Stephen Levitsky and Luke and Way have updated their frameworks to capture this. Their argument is sobering. Democratic erosion in the 21st century usually doesn't come from tanks rolling into the Capitol. It comes gradually, procedurally, often legally. One judicial appointment, one media acquisition, one electoral rule change at a time. So that's our foundational vocabulary: politics, power, authority, the state, the regime, democracy in its various forms. Hold on to these terms. We're going to spend the rest of the course using them.